API docs, REST API docs. So in this context, when a technical writer asks this question, the main difference is the API docs are programming language specific, for which, of course, you need to know coding. API docs would be specific to a particular programming language or multiple programming languages. And when you talk about REST API docs, REST APIs are not programming language specific. So fundamentally, you don't need to know coding, but we'll be talking more about this. Let's see a couple of examples of API docs and REST API docs to be absolutely clear what these are like. First of all, we are all familiar, most of us are familiar with Oxygen. We would have used it for writing content, mostly in data. So if we look at Oxygen API docs, the SDK of Oxygen is created in Java. And to be able to work with this, the programmer would need to know Java. And hence, to document how to work with the Oxygen SDK, to extend the Oxygen functionality, you need to know Java. Even the technical writer would need to know Java, but this is the API doc. What kind of extension or what kind of development will be done using the Oxygen API? Usually to support something in the UI, to support some functionality, to be able to have additional options in the UI, stuff like this. And then there is Madcap Player. Again, most of us have worked with Madcap Player, and that has a plugins API. And the Madcap Player plugins API seems to be written in C#, although I'm not sure because it requires Visual Studio and yeah, it requires .NET Framework. So I'm guessing this is C#. It could also be Visual Basic. And of course, you would need to know C# to write the API docs for the Madcap Player plugins API. Third is a Python API, a transpose function in the pandas library. So what are libraries? Libraries are basically something that provide you functionality in addition to the default functionality of Python or any other language. For example, pandas library lets you process big data sets in Excel, CSV, stuff like this. So there is a transpose function in the pandas library that we can use. By using it, we don't have to write our own code. We can just use this function. We can import the library, use this function, and we can, with one line of code, we can change the rows to columns and columns to rows in an Excel sheet or CSV. And of course, since it's a Python library, we need to know Python to document it. We need to know Python to use. Now let's have a REST API docs example. My favorite REST API docs example happens to be the Google Directions REST API and its docs. You can read the documentation and see that it doesn't mention any coding anywhere. We'll also use this API in Postman to see what it's like to use it in Postman. And here is the Directions API of Google, basically for finding directions. If we were to use this Google functionality without the API, we can go to maps.google.com and we can find directions from Pune to Bangalore, from Pune to Bangalore. And in this, the travel mode is transit. So these are the driving directions. Now, if I have to use a REST API to make the same call. It will be like this. This is the Google Directions API. I send a request from Pune to, this is my API key, which I'll be changing after this session because my credit card is attached to it. And that's how Google will charge me for this. This is how they monetize their REST APIs. And the use case you can think of is Uber. Uber uses Google Directions API in their app. And of course, they use a payment gateway. And they use it to calculate the fare, the way for your journey. So when I make this call, I want the driving directions from Pune to Bengaluru, and I get it in JSON. I can also get it in XML if I want. And the coding bit, if I want to embed it in my code, so typically a partner programmer will be making these calls and they will be embedding it in their code. They can just select the type of code they want to generate. For example, we have Python request code here and Python HTTP client. These are two different kind of libraries that can help us make these requests. So in the Python request API, this will be the code. As you see, we didn't have to write this. We got this automatically, and we can give this to the, we can write this, we can have this example sample in our REST API documentation. I didn't have to write the code, but I do have to understand what really is happening here. This part is JSON or XML. It doesn't involve any coding. It is key value pairs. We can easily manipulate them in the URL or in the query params. And for making this query, this would be the request code in Python request library. So we can embed this so that if you were a technical writer at Google, you would embed this code and give it as a sample to a Python programmer who could embed this in their app code and get the direction between uh, two, between the origin and destination, and use a security key. And this security key will ensure you keep a tab on the request they are making and you charge them according to that, because getting started with this directions API involves attaching your credit card to a security key. Yeah, this is how Google will monetize. This is the whole business of REST APIs. If you go through the REST API documentation of the Google Directions API, you will see that coding is really not involved there. It's mostly about a URL in which you have the REST API calls are mostly about URLs that have base URL, key value pairs of criteria such as origin is this and destination is this and what should be the medium. And there is an authorization key to make the calls and receive the response. And fundamentally, there is no coding required in using the REST APIs. The programmer can embed the constructs of this in any programming language, which they can get from a tool such as Postman. A tool such as Postman will automatically create the coding in a bunch of programming languages required to make this call. And this is another sign that you need not know the programming, need not know how to program to work with REST APIs or REST API documentation. However, this is a little more nuanced than a